Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the latest session of Islamic at Authors. It should say Islamic at Authors rather than Islamic at Conversations, but this is a conversation as well. And it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome Dr. Mehrunisha Suleman, a colleague at my university, but someone who has been very active in a number of different institutions. She is a doctor squared, as we sometimes like to joke. She's a medical doctor and also a DPhil holder in population health from the University of Oxford. I think the medical degree, was that at Oxford or Cambridge? I can't remember now. From Oxford, sorry.
Both, Usaama.
Both, okay. So, yes, of course, you did your first sort of like part in Cambridge, and then you came and completed at Oxford. And then you also have done postdoctoral positions both at Oxford and Cambridge. So your previous postdoc was at Cambridge, now you're at Oxford. Of course, since I am a purely Oxford person, I have not crossed that divide. I have very studiously chosen to indicate that we're both from Oxford, not given anything to the other side. But mashallah, a very accomplished scholar who has, as I say, sort of accomplishments in the sciences. I think you have a BA in biomedical sciences. You also have an MSc in global health from Oxford. You have, and the BA was from Cambridge. And you're actually also involved in a number of institutions. So you're I think just wrapped up a postdoc project in Cambridge, and you're doing a postdoc project in Oxford at the Nuffield Centre, if I recall, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, where you're a council member as well. I'm not sure if that's with Oxford or not, because I think the Nuffield Council is actually independent.
Yeah, the Nuffield Council is a separate entity.
And recently, I'm a little sort of unclear because some versions of the text actually say it was published last year, and some versions say it was published in 2021, but you've recently published a book called Islam and Biomedical Research Ethics. And this is alongside a number of journal articles that, of course, have been streaming through over the years. So firstly, I guess congratulations on your first monograph, which I read a few weeks ago now, and felt greatly informed about an area on which I have very limited experience, specifically biomedical research ethics. But obviously there's the Islam side of things, and I look forward to engaging in a conversation with you over the next hour and a half, inshallah. And I guess one final thing I'd like to add about your own bio, which is particularly unique in a sense, is that you're also trained as an alima. So you studied with Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadwi, who's my own teacher at the As-Salam Institute, going back years. Remind me when you started studying with Sheikh Akram, roughly?
From 2005, 2006, when I first moved to Oxford.
So we actually started studying with Sheikh Akram around the same time, yes, which is amazing.
Were you in his classes at LMC?
Yes, the Muwatta classes and Sharh Qatr al-Nada. Yes.
We started together.
Right. I have a bit of a cheat sheet with Sheikh Akram, which is that I attended a summer course, an Arabic course, where he was invited as a lecturer. This was in 2002. And then thereafter, when I first came to Oxford, so I was kind of introduced to him for the first time at that point. And I was told that, this is kind of, he's an encyclopedic scholar. At that point, he hadn't actually completed his encyclopedic works, but he was prolific already at that point. And then when I came to Oxford in 2004 as an undergraduate, I knocked on his door at the Centre for Islamic Studies and asked him if I could sort of study certain texts with him. And he kind of humoured me and let me read some, adab works with him briefly. I think this would have been early 2004, and then, late 2004, early 2005. So that's roughly when I'm thinking. But that wasn't anything substantive. The real stuff started at the LMC, as you mentioned. And I think your brother was there as well, who was also an Oxford graduate. So, it's a great pleasure. That's a bit of a trip down memory lane there. I just wanted to add that any audience members, if you wish to sort of ask questions, you can. Sometimes we have live questions, but a lot of our audience actually watches the replay. So this will be up on YouTube, and hopefully at some point when I have a little more time, I'm going to convert it to podcasts as well. So please do feel free to ask any questions in the comments, in the chat. Basically, they'll come up in the comments, and then I will be able to sort of put those questions to Mehrun, and we'll be able to engage them. So just a bit on format, and I'm sorry I've gone on for so long. I don't usually, like, this has been an interesting conversation from the start, really, Mehrun. But usually I ask authors to briefly introduce their book. You can take 10-15 minutes, as much or as little as you would like. And then I launch into a bit of a conversation. I've read sections, well, actually I've read the whole book a few weeks ago, but there were certain sections which I sort of thought were particularly interesting, and we can have a conversation about them. If people have questions, we'll try and address those perhaps towards the end of the hour. Yeah, inshallah, that is kind of the format. And please remember to viewers to like, follow, and subscribe. And inshallah, you'll be able to get notifications about future videos as well. So without further ado, and I apologize for the long introduction, Mehrun, I think it was kind of necessary given sort of your various accolades, but if you'd like to briefly introduce your book, inshallah.
Jazakallah so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman. Usaama, it's a wonderful privilege to be with you here. And what I want to do is briefly share with you why it is that I undertook the work. The book itself is called Islam and Biomedical Research Ethics. And to contextualize the recent work that I undertook, it is very important for us to have a little bit of a familiarity with biomedical research ethics in and of itself. We often think about medicine as a very well established practice, which of course it is. But within that, there are particular domains that are a lot more recent, and medical ethics in and of itself is a good example of that, as well as research ethics, which is a subdomain. And although the interaction of the physician and the patient has been something that has been commented on in terms of the underlying values and principles since the time of Hippocrates, in recent history, when we look at what happened in Nazi Germany and the atrocities that took place, and physicians were put to task, taken to trial in Nuremberg, it became very clear that as a profession, doctors need to do more to govern themselves, but that there also needs to be more work externally to be interrogating how it is that medicine is practiced, but also the duties and responsibilities of doctors and researchers is understood and governed. And so we then got the codes from those Nuremberg trials, as well as subsequently the Helsinki Declaration, and very quickly there was a formulation of principles like autonomy as well as informed consent, which mean that we can't do any form of clinical work or research without the permission of the people who we are undertaking that work on. And from there, the entire field of clinical ethics as well as research ethics really took off. And that was incredibly important, particularly when we reflect on what's been happening in the last year. I mean, it's interesting that we're having this conversation today during a pandemic. And although we're doing particularly well in the UK, where we're seeing a very long shadow of the pandemic in this country in terms of its consequences, as well as abroad, and so how it is we conduct ourselves in terms of biomedical research is very, very critical when we think about principles. So one of the things that I was interested in as a medical student, but then subsequently as a clinician, is how is it that these principles are understood and applied in contexts other than the UK, Europe, and North America? And this is because a lot of medical research gets done abroad. And often there is an expectation that research is conducted with guidelines that are authored in Europe and North America. And so that was something immediately that I was interested in. And the other aspect that I was keen to look at is how it is that people's religious and cultural commitments come into play when they think about the types of research that they consider appropriate to conduct, but also the way in which the research in and of itself is carried out. And of course, we're in the context of COVID-19, but a lot of the reflections that are brought to bear in the book is about a very important previous sort of global epidemic, HIV/AIDS. And some of the questions that come to the fore is, how do religious communities enumerate the problems in their populations, as well as think about how to address challenges of pandemics and epidemics like HIV/AIDS, when there is a requirement for them to be committing to interventions that they would consider morally and potentially legally problematic in terms of their religious paradigm. And that applies to, for example, needle exchange programs for people who are intravenous drug users, as well as barrier contraception for different groups, particularly groups that are considered within the global health and public health domain, marginalized groups. So that's the backdrop to the work. And looking at the context of Muslim countries in particular was something that I thought would be an important contribution to make. But what I'll do is I'll stop there, Usaama, because I'm sure there are questions that you'd like to ask, or that we can take from that backdrop.
Absolutely. I mean, there are. I've got plenty of questions. If you want to midstream during my questions elaborate further on certain components of your argument, or the sorts of empirical research that you've been able to, you've done a lot of on the ground interviewing and so on. So what you've been able to uncover, please feel free to sort of interrupt me midstream and ask or give sort of an elaboration of those, particularly since I've not given you a great deal of time, I suppose, and this is an opportunity, I think, for you to sort of articulate. It's your hour, so to speak, so please don't hesitate to take that. But I found, like, even in the presentation that you've given, and it's there embedded in the introduction of the work, and it's kind of implicit throughout, that this is an enterprise that has developed in the West, of course, so in a kind of Euro-American context. Particularly, I think Nuremberg is one of those signal moments in our recent history in Europe that we think about as really, bringing into question, the ethics of being a clinician of some kind. And more recently, of course, you've had the torture memos and the things associated with what the US has been engaged in, which have, I think, brought a sort of like, they've put a spotlight on these issues, unfortunately, again. It's not unfortunate that it's brought a spotlight, but it's unfortunate that it's happening again, of course. But this is part of the challenge, I think, of the human condition on a very fundamental level. But one of the things that you do mention here, and the example I gave just now, one is from Europe, the other is from America, right? And so there has been, of course, a sort of an effort to critique this kind of first in Europe, then everywhere else, or first in sort of the West, and then those values need to go everywhere else. And that's something that kind of happens by default. But I wonder if you have perhaps taken the opportunity to consider this beyond this work. I didn't find too much exploration of the question of Eurocentrism, or what. I think this is also a challenge because it's more in the social sciences, and you were saying that you're kind of balancing this effort to in the liminal space, I think you put it, between the social sciences and the hard sciences, so to speak. But Deepash Chakrabarti, an historian who talks about provincializing Europe, that's the title of one of his important books from the year 2000. And this goes back to Edward Said in a sense, that effort to sort of the kind of post-colonial turn, shall we say. And I wonder if that's something that you've had the opportunity to reflect on, or would like to reflect on in this particular context. That do we have indigenous traditions that we could also explore, but they're basically left by the wayside because these are parts of the world which are in dire straits, very often economically, politically, and in other respects.
So it's a really good question, Usaama, and it's a really important one to reflect on when we think about the industry of biomedicine, and not just clinical practice. The sorts of the hand-to-hand combat that doctors do at the bedside. It's more about that larger picture involving companies, industry, a huge amount of revenue, and so there is a global process and progress that has occurred and is occurring that we do need to be mindful of. And what it means is that one of the things that I did as part of my research was review research ethics guidelines that prevail in the OIC countries. And what I found was that a lot of middle income to higher income countries who want to be attractive for medical research have invested very, very heavily in having some sort of research ethics and research infrastructure. And what this means is we can't think about countries with a Muslim majority population in isolation, nor can we just think about Europe and North America as operating in isolation. Biomedicine is a global endeavor and has been for several decades. And what that means is there is, of course, a dominant paradigm. And that is because of how medical research is used and cited. And the more citations you have, the more a particular practice or a particular way of thinking becomes entrenched. But what we're seeing more and more is an interface of some of the countries. For example, Qatar is a good one, where there's been a burgeoning investment in biomedical research, as well as practice that is locally funded and locally. There's a lot of local investment in trying to bring up local researchers, and what that's doing is it's forcing conversations about the role of local histories, culture, religious traditions in informing, for example, their genomics, population genomics programs. And something that I've been involved in recently is how it is that we can involve different publics, but also different voices and authorities in thinking about the prioritization of genomics research. And that's a very good sort of point at which we can riff off this notion of different types of knowledge and different types of authorities. We know that biomedicine is incredibly influential, both as an industry, but also as an epistemic discourse, but that doctors themselves hold a lot of authority in their communities, in their practice. And so one of the things that I came across during my research is, interestingly, that religious scholars also carry a very similar stature. And so when these these two types of authority come into play in that political as well as lay sphere, it does bring to bear very interesting conversations and tensions.
Right, right. And I must apologize a little. My my 3-year-old might be knocking on the door, so
Oh,
please
that's okay.
forgive him. It's nice to have him. He's just flown in actually from abroad, so I'm very happy to have him in the house. Alhamdulillah.
You can let him
Uh,
join us, Usaama.
Unfortunately, I've locked the door and sort of like it's at a distance, so you might see the sort of silhouette of a cat behind me. So this is I'm at my father's house, and this is the family cat. So I think that is really I think the historical context and the sort of the geographic context in many respects is so important. And you mentioned Qatar, and Qatar is one of these interesting cases where they're trying to sort of engage in that sort of cross-cultural dialogue of sorts. But it, of course, takes place in a context where, a country like Qatar is minuscule compared to the great powers that exist today, whether it's, America, China, India. And the sort of ethical contexts in different states are very often contingent on their political circumstances as well. So, the West has certain sort of paradigms that come out of, recent experiences that we've spoken about. In places like China, they have very little compunction in using sort of prisoners like Uyghurs for all sorts of medical experimentation, from what we can understand. And in India as well, there are interesting sort of apparently some of the dilemmas that come up with stem cell research just don't occur in a place like India for a lot of researchers because their paradigms are so different. And I think that's another dimension of this which is sort of worth bearing in mind. I think the question which kept on coming up in my mind as I was reading your work is that this is all in many respects written from that epistemic paradigm that is the context in which most of us work, right? We're working within the Western Academy. And even sort of institutions like the Qatar sort of universities and the like are being set up in this way with the help of, Western academic institutions, which are the leading institutions of our time that, in some respects, we are bound to sort of have to follow some of the models that are there before us. But I think what would be very interesting is what would it look like if, in that dialogue, and I like the term dialogue that you used, that you have these sort of ulama and medical practitioners in dialogue. One of the things that strikes me as interesting from a historical perspective is that historically the sort of like Islamic scholarly side of that argument would have a lot more normative authority. And I suspect a lot of contemporary ulama feel a kind of, why is it that my normative authority doesn't have standing before these people? And I was fascinated by reading some of the excerpts because you've got lots of direct quotes in this. Obviously, everything's coded and I don't know any of the identities. But the way in which some of the researchers who are sitting on these research ethics committees are basically completely dismissive of the knowledge, and in other instances they're like, no, we need to take that into consideration. But in some instances, I was just rereading one section, they're saying that these people, they just don't know the realities. They think that their interpretation of the Quran or the Hadith has to be imposed on everyone else, but they're just basically wrong about it. And what that person is doing in saying things like that is basically, without realizing, making that epistemic claim themselves. They're saying my interpretation of the Quran and Hadith is the authoritative one, and it's sort of like unawares just assimilating sort of the norms that I've picked up without any reflection in my sort of social context or in my academic context. And so in a sense, that makes for some. I think the conversation, I think your book starts a very interesting conversation, and we're going to have to see how much further that can develop. And inshallah, you'll be one of the leaders in that sort of conversation.
So, I mean, that's a really good example to unpick further. And at first glance, it does seem that there is this juxtaposition of one sphere of knowing versus another. But one of the things that I've been learning from the research that I've been doing most recently in the UK on palliative and end of life care is a lot of this dialogue requires so much preparatory work, and unless that preparatory work is in place, that dialogue is no longer a dialogue. It's
Right.
very much you know two people speaking very different
Yeah.
languages,
At cross
and by that,
purposes.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and by that I mean, what a lot of different fora that have been set up in Kuwait as well as Saudi Arabia that have involved, a dialogue between clinicians, researchers, as well as religious scholars, is the success of some of those conversations that have been very carefully commented on by Muhammad Ghali,
Right.
is about relationships. These are people who've got to know each other over numerous conversations, over decades, and they've seen the evolution of different types of technologies, such as assisted reproductive technologies, genetic technologies, and through multiple conversations, they've developed an interdependency. And it's that interdependency that has led to success. And what I found, and that I wasn't necessarily able to reflect on as deeply when I was doing these initial interviews, but have subsequently understood, was that particularly in countries like Malaysia, where an issue that crops up for a research ethics committee that is considered to be pertinent in terms of people's religious commitments, a scholar is brought into the conversation, but in an ad hoc way.
Right.
And that ad hoc interaction of religious authority, but also a type of religious acumen, is very, very difficult to then sort of bring in successfully in that sort of environment. So that interaction is also something for us to be thinking about. If we're going to, in the longer term, have an infrastructure that's successful in, as you described, bringing forwards an indigenous reflection and practice within biomedicine.
And I mean, I think in addition, it's further complicated by the fact that there is a kind of there's a severe imbalance in terms of like status authority on that of intellectual basis.
Sorry, Usaama,
That
I'm
are very
losing you. Hello?
Apologies. I think the internet, if you just give a moment, I think the internet is probably. Can you hear me? Is that any
Yeah,
better?
you're back.
My internet seems to be a bit sort of weak for some reason, so please bear with me. If this persists, I'm going to try and see if I can switch things around. I'll try and sort of just be somewhat concise. I think if I hand over to you, your sound is actually quite clear. So, but can you hear me clearly just now?
Yeah, it's much better now. It's
Fantastic.
much better.
Okay, yeah. So it's saying my internet's far better. I think if you go to much of the Muslim world, so to speak, or Muslim majority world, if we put it that way, I mean, the Muslim world has become a bit of an ambiguous space in some respects. But Sharia knowledge or ilm shara'i is not prestigious in large parts of it. I mean, the places that you've mentioned, which are in the Arabian Gulf, are kind of exceptions to the rule, and population-wise, they're tiny as a percentage of the global Muslim population. But if you go to most Muslim countries, the talented people won't study ulum shari'ah. And so that's a function. Again, there's a sort of colonial sort of legacy to this, which our historical situatedness is something which is unavoidable in this context. But I think the questions that we need to ask, in a sense, is how do we adjust that balance, and then we can start to have less shallow conversations. I mean, I think the challenge that we face, and you kind of reflect this in some of the quotes that you produce of some of the people who are participating, who I'm sure they have the best of intentions, and they're doing, they're articulating what they feel in good conscience to be appropriate, but they reflect a kind of understanding of the religion, which is actually quite superficial and quite shallow in my estimation as a sort of as a scholar of the field. And some of these people are lay people that you're speaking to who are maybe patients, and so it's not to be expected from someone like that that they would be scholarly in their orientation. But as you put it, there needs to be kind of this long-term relationship building. And on the one side, you have this massive infrastructure. If you want to become a doctor, or there are lots of pathways if you're talented to be able to achieve that. If you want to be an Islamic scholar and have a sustainable and respectable life, that there are far more limited opportunities to becoming that. And so when there's that fundamental imbalance just at a social level, it's going to be very difficult for us to think about, okay, how do we incentivize that sort of and they're going to have to probably be on small scales. The sort of initiative that you have undertaken by doing a DPhil in this topic and writing a book about it, in a sense, puts this on the map. But more and more needs to be done in that way, and this field needs to be recognized as a multidisciplinary field that requires people of talent from the ulama side, as well as the abundant talent that is available from the medical side, alhamdulillah, in a country like the UK or in the West more generally, or on the global scale as well. Yeah.
No, I think that's right, Usaama. I mean, I'm always at least a glass half full, if not brimming. But there are green shoots that are visible in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, where there is a huge investment in the Islamic sciences infrastructure. But what they're also doing, and I saw this in Malaysia in particular, in some of the institutions, is a huge commitment within the traditional madrasas to have their graduates then take up degrees within the more sort of conventional universities. And essentially they're building up a cohort of what I would consider bridge scholars, people who are equally versed in terms of knowledge and language in the Islamic sciences, as well as a type of science, be that engineering, medicine, etc. And that's becoming a model that's increasingly attractive to other countries who have the resource to support that. So that's something that's really interesting that's happening in Malaysia, and there's an appetite for something similar in Indonesia. But what I also found that was incredibly important to share in Iran is since the setting up of the Islamic Republic in 1979, scholars based out of Qum and beyond in cities like Isfahan, for example, are very, very committed to providing support to any of the other infrastructure, be that hospitals, be that civil engineering spaces, etc. And so there is this model that exists in Iran, which I think is incredibly interesting. I had the wonderful privilege of going to Qum and speaking to a few of the scholars that are based in the seminary, who themselves are traditionally trained scholars, have then been familiarizing themselves with advancements in biomedicine, and are, I would consider, sort of global experts in being able to reflect on how it is that emerging questions and challenges ought to be interpreted and addressed within the sort of modern Iran. And a really good example of that is the scholarly engagement in Iran in terms of assisted reproductive technologies. Iran is one of the few countries that has been very proactive in thinking about gamete donation as well as embryo donation for couples that are facing the challenge of infertility. And of course, there is a difference when we think about majority Sunni countries and their engagement with such questions. So there will be differences in terms of outcomes, of course. But overall, there is an investment in that scholarly dialogue as well as expertise that I think is important for us to be mindful of.
I mean, just out of curiosity, in that particular sort of question, gamete donation, obviously that's something which is within sort of Sunni legal thinking, currently beyond the pale, so to speak. It's not some, and I'm just wondering what the rationale is behind the sort of justification of it. Yeah, I mean, just from a Sunni perspective, this would be considered as a kind of like it would cause problems with determining a nasab in a sense, right? So yeah.
So I will try and keep this brief because I do like to spend a very, very long time discussing this, particularly with my anthropology students who do this as part of their religion and health module. And for those tuning in, I recommend Marcia Inhorn's work. She's done fantastic work understanding the experiences of couples facing the challenge of infertility and accessing assisted reproductive technologies. But one of the things that comes out of some of the scholarly discourse in Iran and some of the scholars that I spoke to is, how we understand parenthood. And is it genetic parenting? Is it the relationship of the womb? And so if the birthing mother is considered the mother, then her the person she is married to, it can then be considered the father, or is there the consideration of social parenting? The people who provide tarbiyah as well as material support and upbringing for the child, and that's been something that scholars in Iran have been incredibly interested in, and they see that limiting the definition of parenthood to genetic parenting is not necessarily sufficient, but also that the right of a couple to have a child is incredibly important, and any technologies that are available to allow them to avail themselves of that right is also important. Now, what's interesting is
the right of having a child in particular.
The right of having a child, yes.
Right.
What's interesting is they haven't quite yet got to grips with how inheritance is to be worked out. So is the child eligible for inheriting from the genetic parents or from the birthing mother / the social parents? So it's a conversation that is still very much live within the Iranian scholarly discourse, and I think it's an interesting one, because what we know of from Marcia Inhorn's work is Sunni families, for example, from Egypt, who are desperate to have a child, be that something that's of an individual concern, but also of a social concern, do travel to countries like Iran for to avail themselves of the services. And so it does bring to question what becomes prevalent within Sunni society, yet the legal and ethical discourse hasn't quite got to grips with the types of choices and decisions that families are having to undertake.
Yes, I mean, I think, there's in the sort of also in fiqh literature, or in fiqh more generally, the discussion of ulum al-balwa, if something becomes a widespread practice. My impression, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination sort of an expert on the Shi'i tradition and the legal tradition. But yeah, the Sunni schools do tend to, on a number of these questions, stick closer to the text, I think, in the sense that Iran has, I think, one of the highest rates in the world of sex change surgery. And that's something which is generally not seen as accepted within the Sunni tradition, although I think there the problem is a lot less sensitive than the nasab problem that arises from gamete donation. And I think one of the things that you said, it kind of signals one of the normative questions that kept coming up for me in the book, which is, what is the source of one's normativity, right? And there, that question isn't addressed very directly. In my experience, there are hints here and there. I've got a quote. I think this is, I have to look up which page it's on actually, but it says, I think it's important to highlight here that the emphasis I think this is in the introduction right towards the beginning, the emphasis within this book is not to suggest or stress a distinction between Islamic and global bioethics. Rather, it is to provide insights on how commonly accepted principles such as autonomy are understood and applied within Islamic and Muslim contexts, and whether there are particular ethical and or practical contextual challenges and or considerations that are necessary when such principles are deliberated. And I think the question for me which is really interesting here is autonomy has a philosophical literature attached to it in the Western tradition that comes out of distinct traditions, I think particularly notable since the Enlightenment. The Islamic tradition will have a conception of autonomy. It's not usually articulated as autonomy per se, right? I mean, what we'd end up doing there is we found a concept that is widespread in the Western tradition, and then we start to mine the Islamic tradition to see if we can find that concept. And for me, in the context of the global sort of power imbalances, it's kind of motivated thinking. It's to a certain extent, there's going to be, and the researcher obviously has to be very wary of cognitive dissonance in their research and things like that, and confirmation bias and all the rest of it. I didn't feel in some of these questions that was being grappled with very, very directly. So I wonder, when you say, for example, Marcia Enhorn, and thank you very much for introducing me to her work, the traditions of anthropology in particular are very, I think, self-conscious about those different value sort of propositions in different traditions of reflection. It's very cognizant of social construction of values and so on. I wonder to what extent we need to take seriously the Islamic tradition's own sort of constructions of these various values, and bring them into conversation with the West on their own terms, rather than sort of what we inevitably do given our sort of academic setting. We start off with the Western reading of these sorts of things and then think, I wonder what it says in the Islamic tradition, right? So yeah, I just sort of wonder, like, when you talk about sort of the value, obviously, like even the trauma of not being able to have a child for it's, I think, more emphasized for a woman in the Quran, but it's talked about, it's kind of referred to in the Quran. وَيَجْعَلُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ عَقِيمًا. And it's kind of like this, I'm doing a superficial reading, I've not gone and explored the tafsir, but it's kind of this, like, this is God's sort of like choice, and it's, humans have very little say about it. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't try, if we have the space, to transform that, to try and realize some kind of a change. And I wonder if you think that those dilemmas could be explored in sort of if you want to perhaps do an experiment in exploring some of those dilemmas, like just as we're in discussion.
No, I agree, Usaama, and it is work that is informing what I am currently doing, particularly around the conversation
I
I've
think you
been
would say
having
that.
with patients and families, in terms of their meaning making, their understanding around death and dying, and how it is that we
Right.
can use learning from that in enriching what we consider the wider body of work in terms of palliative and end of life care. What I was trying to do in terms of what's been published in the book and the DFIL research is, I was toying with the idea of doing what you described, which is, let's look at the sources and think about how it is that we would inform the conduct of research. But very quickly, I became aware of this tension that researchers in countries like Malaysia and Iran themselves face. They have this pro forma that they are required to work through because of their funding requirements, their collaborative obligations, and for them to publish in competitive journals. And for them to be a part of that global industry of biomedical research. And given that stipulation, I wanted to see, well, are there tensions, in terms of their own religious understandings and religious commitments, and what do we glean from that? And you're absolutely right. The next step from that is, where do we take that learning? And I'll give you an example. So when I spoke to researchers, research ethics committee members, scholars in Iran, particularly about the issue of women's participation in research. And it's crucially important that I provide the backdrop that women's participation in medical research across the board has been poor. This isn't something that is specific to any of the countries that I have mentioned, or to the Muslim world. Women have been underrepresented in health research, and there's a lot of growing literature commenting on that. What I wanted to do was to understand the particularity of that within countries like Malaysia and Iran. And in Iran, some of the researchers said, it is very, very difficult for us to enroll women into research as well as in Malaysia, because we need to be sensitive to family dynamics, and if research requires women to be away from their homes, away from obligations that they have, then it is something that we do need to consider. And being given that this was a research context, it wasn't polite conversation, I was able to ask difficult questions like, well, does this fall within the parameters of your standard operating procedures for research? Is this part of the guidelines that you use to govern your processes? And in Malaysia, they said, no, we have the guidelines that are used in other parts of the world. But what we do as a research ethics committee or as individual researchers is adapt these based on our contexts. And so very quickly, I asked the question of, well, does this impact the inclusion and access for women to participate in research? And some of the researchers said, look, if it's bog standard research, like we're looking at the effectiveness of a cholesterol lowering drug, as part of treatment for heart disease, then we'll make sure that there's as many men as women in the research. But if it's something that is to do with women's health, then that does require very careful negotiation and understanding, and it is an under-researched area, and logistics do come into play, and that experience is something that also ties in with the broader global experience of women's health research. But when we look at the particularity of for example, domestic violence, intimate partner violence research, there is something that is specific about women's own understanding of privacy, their relationship with their partners, that does come into play. And that's where the interpretation of the religious tradition is something that researchers themselves expressed as being important. And some of what you've described, Usaama, is very critical there. We see that a discipline like anthropology, which has a huge investment in reflexivity, is something that we do need to draw on. A lot of the researchers that I spoke to said that when they undertake this sort of research in terms of intimate partner violence, domestic partner violence, they approach it as public health researchers, but very quickly they realize that the sorts of conversations that they're having with women is incredibly sensitive, and they don't necessarily have the infrastructure in place to be supporting these conversations, but also providing the aftercare that the women need when initiating these very, very difficult conversations.
Yeah. And in some respects, I mean, it finds itself, women in these circumstances are in a double bind, right? I mean, or sometimes a triple bind. They talk about sort of women in a place like the UK having a triple penalty because of being Muslim, coloured, and women, so to speak. But with respect to a kind of global Islamophobia industry, which makes a great deal of hay about the misogyny of Islam in particular, those sorts of things will almost inevitably kind of seep into whether it's the researchers or indeed the Muslim sort of participants' sort of social imaginary, so to speak. I remember as an undergraduate, and I did my undergraduate at Oxford. I remember a Muslim approaching me and asking me in my course, actually, is Islam a violent religion, right? And what's fascinating is, people don't sort of turn around and ask, well, is Europe or is America a violent sort of like part of the world, or is the West a violent sort of geopolitical entity? Because certain types of violence we understand are acceptable. Other types, the sorts of violence conducted by the United States in Iraq or Afghanistan is civilizing violence, whereas other types of violence are terrorism, so to speak. And that's about narrative creation, but it's also about that narrative creation creates a social imaginary. And so a woman who may be suffering what is considered domestic violence by Muslim scholars, right, is then sort of potentially at risk of being disregarded by people who are saying, oh, she's crying wolf on the terms of another civilization that is there to attack us. And so you have all of these horrible calculations that end up having to be made, and how do you kind of rectify that while also realizing sort of the aims of doing fair-minded research that is so deeply embedded within presuppositions that are coming from a Euro-American context as well. It's not an easy question, but I think it's just something that we're constantly having to sort of negotiate and think about.
And I think some of this is where sort of methodologically, it's a funny thing. I'd always seen myself as a quantitative scientist, and because of these very questions, I have become committed to lived experiences, and it's through people's voices, their own experiences, that we begin to understand the intricacies of the differences in power, and understanding the differences in power, be that a woman's perception of religious knowledge, religious authority, and her acceptance of that, be that her domestic circumstance, her domestic relationships, and it's when we are able to appreciate that from somebody's own voice and somebody's own experience, that we can then ignore what that surrounding noise is, and really think about what is in front of us, and what I learn from what I've learned from a lot of the interviews that I've conducted as part of this this previous research and some of the research that I'm doing is sadly the predicaments of vulnerable people is something that is shared. It's sadly a universal experience. It's not specific to a particular community or a particular group of people.
Right.
But what it does point to is, places and people who've managed to be creative, be proactive about solving some of these challenges are ones that we do need to really look out for. And some of the novel practices that I found in Malaysia and in Iran from both sort of researchers, research ethics committee members, is being very open about some of these questions.
Right.
And one of the researchers that I spoke to in Iran, interestingly, you mentioned this issue of autonomy, as a very sort of Western secular construct. But we know that a lot of traditions, a lot of different types of knowledge and conversations think about bodily integrity, freedoms, and the researcher in Iran was talking about how for him, as somebody very well versed in the Shi'i tradition, as well as being a doctor, being a researcher, he and his wife, he described how he and his wife within the social space have equal freedoms. But in the familial space, they both have less freedoms than they do outside because of the obligations that they have to one another as well as to their children. And I found that description a really interesting one, and one that speaks to the type of relational autonomy that we understand. And is that somebody trying to get into where you are?
That's my son in the background. He's a 3-year-old. He likes making funny noises. Apologies. I mean, he's a joy to have around.
No, not at all. It's lovely to hear from him. But yeah,
I just wanted.
Yeah, sorry, go on, Usaama.
Sorry, I just wanted to say. I mean, I'm not sort of dismissing autonomy as a category. I'm just saying that it's situated, right? I think autonomy is one of those extremely important sort of features of the liberal tradition, which I think it's one of the pillars. It's one of the key ideas that people have their individual autonomy. They are individuals primarily, and that's kind of the most important identifying feature about them. And then, in addition to that, they have that freedom, that autonomy, so to speak. But all I'm suggesting is that that reading of the nature of the individual as being, the key component of their identity is their individuality and their autonomy, is of course something that varies from time to time, place to place. And the Islamic tradition will have a different conception of autonomy to the Western tradition, right? So I'm just using this kind of very common distinction between the concept and the conception. And one of the things that I really think about when thinking about provincializing Europe is we need to articulate the Islamic conceptions of these various ideas rather than assuming, and you're not doing this, I think there's kind of different ways in which the concept of autonomy is dealt with in the text, which reflects the nuances of different contexts. So I'm not suggesting that you're not cognizant of this, but in a sense, provincializing Europe will be realized by recognizing that all of its claims to having certain concepts as being universal are actually the instantiation of a European or a Eurocentric conception of that idea that they've managed to universalize through, just as an example that you gave, like if you want to publish in our competitive journal, or if you want to be able to receive our grants, which are the most generous in the world, then you have to conform to these standards. And that's how you're able to sort of, in a sense, subtly impose your values on a global scale, so to speak. And my question is, like, if we weren't under obligation to Eurocentrism, how would we potentially construct if we were on equal terms, economically, epistemically, in terms of power, how would we conceive of these questions, and what would be important to us? Rather, would those things vary over time? The human sort of like the human being is remarkably sort of flexible in terms of what they consider to be I mean, those things have varied so dramatically over human history, right?
No, so, you're absolutely right, Usaama. And I mean, some of that challenge, some of the questions you're asking, within the global health space is beginning. The shift to sort of decolonialize curricula, think very differently about how medical research is constructed, how it is that we set priorities, and how we involve publics or let publics be the protagonists in determining what's important for them, being the drivers for those priorities. And maybe it is important for us to sort of see, how those sorts of practices emerge, but also be involved in those conversations and those sorts of practices in countries where Islam predominates. I mean, it'd be lovely, for example, and I'm going to try and twist your arm, Usaama, for us to be able to think,
absolutely,
to think and reflect more on this. That does a practice, when we're thinking about research and the generation of knowledge that's rooted within the Islamic tradition, resemble a more communitarian construction of knowledge that really does draw on people's experiences. And I know, sadly, that there is a challenge to that, which is, even within the Islamic tradition, there is a hierarchy when we think about how knowledge is generated. So there may still be challenges within the tradition itself that we do need to be reflective of and open to considering. And of course, religious knowledge is particular, but the reason why biomedical knowledge is important to think about differently is because of what it involves. And some would say, people's spiritual concerns are more pertinent for us to be sensitive of, in terms of including them and empowering them over. But one of the conversations I just had with hospice staff yesterday was around their concerns for Muslim women in the, for example, they care for Muslim women who aren't confident about speaking English. They often have male relatives at the bedside who translate for them, who advocate for them. And often nursing staff are unsure of whether the patient is really able to be involved in their care. Particularly when it comes to the very sensitive issue of pain relief at the end of life. There is a belief that sedation, a state of altered consciousness, may prevent people from reciting the Shahada or, being conscious of God in the dying moments. And some families are very committed to ensuring that that doesn't happen to their loved one. And nursing staff say that, even if this is a view that is expressed by patients themselves, that is reinforced by family members, what do we do in those dying moments when somebody is incredibly agitated, incredibly breathless, is very visibly in agony?
Right.
And so it's something, again, that I don't have an answer to,
Yeah.
but it's something that we do need to be having a conversation about as a community.
I absolutely. I mean, this is something which I actually experienced. My brother actually passed away with cancer a couple of years ago in the room next to me. Rahmatullahi alayh. He wrote a wonderful book just before he passed. But Nabil al-Azami, if anyone's interested in looking up that book, and Mehroon, I believe you were at the wake for my brother's. So Jazakumullah khair, you knew my brother very well, but I mean, it's really sort of, I think it's nice to have actually a practical question come out of this as well, because this is a very alive, issue for a lot of people. And I think to a certain extent, these are circumstances which require a kind of, to use the Islamic traditional sort of term, ijtihad, which, I mean, if I may, Mehran, since you're actually sort of trained in the Islamic tradition as well, these are instances where people like yourself are actually particularly, it's really wonderful to have people like yourself in the practical field. So inshallah, I hope that you will be someone who is basically giving fatwas on these sorts of issues in the near future. But I mean, just as someone who's actually studying with Shah Akram and training in ifta, so to speak, it's I think it's an area which definitely deserves research. And in my estimation, it seems very odd to insist that people should be feeling excruciating pain in order to be able to say La ilaha illallah. The most obvious thing that comes to my mind is precisely what my brother did, which was to engage in all of those du'as. And my mother also passed away with cancer and went into palliative care about 20 years ago or so. To engage in all of those du'as before one goes into the state of complete sedation. And it seems the most obvious that there is no justification, in my estimation, to perpetuate people's pain. Ad-darar marfu', as the sort of the legal principle states, or ad-darar yuzal. So that would be my take on that particular question. But I think you earlier were talking about the idea of communitarian sort of conceptions of the good, perhaps. And I think these are, I have a kind of bizarre, I have to articulate it more thoroughly over the course of writing, but I have a sort of unusual conception of what constitutes a religion in the first place. And I actually think of liberalism and a lot of these Western ideologies as religions from an Islamic perspective. So they would count as deen. The Islamic conception of deen is quite different to the way in which sort of deen has been constructed in the modern period over the last few hundred years as a particular sort of type of practice, so to speak. But from an Islamic perspective, a deen is something which is a system of values that informs your sort of conduct and also provides laws for social cohesion, so for the existence of a community. So in a sense, a deen is a communitarian endeavor. But in my estimation, that's what liberalism is. That's what sort of nationalism, secularism, these are all in that sort of way. We all follow laws. They're just secular laws, right? It's and so in that sort of estimation, and we have a question which we'll address. I'll share that on the screen in a moment. You've come at just the right time because we're around the hour. But in my estimation, it's like, these are all communitarian traditions of sorts. It's certain types of communitarian traditions are on the ascendant, and therefore we must conform to them, because whether it's for getting grants or, to avoid certain types of ostracism if you don't conform to them, or you might find yourself on the wrong side of the law as well. And in that regard, it then becomes haram to engage in that sort of activity from an Islamic perspective as well. And I think the Islamic context, for Muslims who are living as sort of minorities in a certain context, they shouldn't have the aspiration to have political domination. But Islam has its kind of in its own majority context, conceptualizes itself as this sort of total system, in the same way that secularism or liberalism can be conceivably understood as total systems as well. So that's a kind of very roundabout way of thinking about this, but I hope that sort of just maybe problematizes our sort of way of thinking about Islam as very often in competition with universal categories, whereas I personally think of Islam as in competition with a provincialized sort of European doctrine that has gone global because of colonialism, right? That's my way of thinking about it. But we live in its shadow, and you can't really be in dialogue as an equal partner if you're extremely weak, and the state of the Muslim world is that it's extremely weak. But it does create interesting sort of ways of reconceptualizing the types of dialogue we can engage in, I think. I hope that made some sort of sense.
No, absolutely, Usaama. And I mean, that's a whole conversation, a separate conversation that we can be having. But I mean, what you shared about Nabil Bhai's reflections and understanding, it's incredibly helpful, and so helpful for us to be sharing more widely, because there is a deep misunderstanding about what the requirements are, in terms of people's people ensuring that they're meeting the rituals and requirements around death. But that's not to say that people do have preferences and their own notions of what a good death looks like for them. But yeah, no, Jazakallah so much for sharing that. You mentioned that there was a question.
Yes, so if you go on the comments on your right-hand side, you can see it. I'm going to share it on the screen so we'll all be able to read it, inshallah. So I'm just going to read it. Yusuf Ali, who's a regular, Jazakallah khairan, is asking, does not saying the shahada on one's deathbed do anything to invalidate the fact that a person said it with conviction during one's life? And I think that's a very important question in this context. And my understanding is, and I haven't gone and looked at the commentaries on this in particular. Actually, I may have when my brother was unwell, but I'm quite certain that this is something which is a recommended act. There are certain hadiths where the Prophet ﷺ, there's a famous hadith, I believe, I can't remember the name of the Sahabi, but a woman was brought to her child's deathbed and asked by the Prophet, can you forgive your son for his kind of poor behavior towards you during his lifetime, because he's unable to say the shahada otherwise. And so there's a kind of, and she I can't recall off the top of my head whether this is an authentic hadith or not, but it's very emphatic about the fact that she initially says, yes, I forgive him, but then the Prophet asks her again because he's still unable to say the shahada, and then when she genuinely forgives him, he's able to utter the shahada. So it seems to indicate a great deal of emphasis on the need to say shahada for someone's salvation or something. But my understanding is actually that hadith is not taken as a universal rule. People can die in all sorts of circumstances, sudden deaths, they die in a car accident, they have a heart attack, etc. No one considers those sorts of people to be necessarily, in fact some of them are considered shuhada, right, according to various sort of if someone dies from falling masonry, or they die drowning, etc., and they've not been able to say these sorts of things, they're still considered shaheed. So my understanding is that it's not really absolutely essential, and they affect you. If you think about it, someone might have for some random reason not be able to say it, and they've lived a pious life their entire life. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Shahab Hakim Murad once commented, God will not send you to hell on a technicality, which is a very funny way of putting it. Anyway, I hope that made some sense. But Jazakumullah khair. I mean, I think Mehrun, you know a number of scholars and Sheikh Akram in particular, and you know, I don't know if you've had the sort of. I'm sure you've been asked to teach with Sheikh Akram's sort of as-salam in the past, but inshallah, I mean, I hope you could potentially, complete iftar studies with Sheikh Akram, and then
Plan.
you'd be inshallah sorry?
It's the plan, inshallah.
It's the plan. So alhamdulillah, I mean, like Sheikh Akram is someone who has been conducting with current teachers of as-salam certain classes on a reasonably regular basis. So, and those recordings will be made available to other, teachers, inshallah, as well. So I'm sure you will. But I think it's just so valuable to have someone with your expertise in a broad range of areas, also to have that, in addition to the alimiyah, the sort of qualification to actually give fatwas authoritatively on these questions. But it's also wonderful, I think, for us to create this community, because one of the things that I've found is, just by attending Sheikh Akram's iftar sessions, you have this community of other scholars you can be in dialogue with. You have questions, and there's a team of scholars who are thinking about all sorts of questions all the time. So that's something that we can look forward to, I think, in the future, that there are greater numbers of people who can start to do that crossover work, in which people like yourself are so essential, of course, inshallah. I don't have a great many other questions, but I did have, and please feel free to sort of, I really enjoyed the fact that you're asking me some questions, to be honest. But I just wanted to ask just a reflection on a comment you made. You made a reference to Peter Singer's work, and you're quoting him here, I think. You say, ethics is concerned with determining rightness and wrongness of actions, decisions, or goals. And I kind of added a comment there. This, to me, sounds just like fiqh. For me, fiqh is actually an ethical discourse, right? I mean, so much of fiqh doesn't have any implications for the state, right? And that's how we kind of define law in the kind of post-Westphalian context, where the state has become this, leviathan. But fiqh is actually more ethics than it is law as conceived of in the modern period. And I wonder, does that mean that in order for us to really do medical ethics well, we also need to explore the ethical implications that are found within our fiqh tradition? And perhaps I could ask you about one specific question that comes up, which is, and we could have a conversation on it, which you talk about this idea of women saying, or various people saying, they can't leave the house without the permission of their husband, right? So, and I wonder, you don't really address that normatively. You're kind of just engaging in an empirical sort of, this is what people are saying repeatedly. Maybe you did. It's been a few weeks since I read the book, but I just wonder if you wanted to sort of think about, how do we negotiate with that sort of an idea that comes in the fiqh tradition, for example?
Yeah, so a couple of things to say on that, Usaama. The first is, for anybody who's interested in knowing a little bit more about the backdrop in terms of Islam and medical ethics, I recommend work that's been done by Dr. Asim Padella. He's published a couple of papers that speak to what Usaama's been describing in terms of the role of fiqh or jurisprudence in really informing how it is that we engage with sort of existing as well as emerging questions within clinical practice as well as biomedical research. The question you raise about women requiring permission to leave the home, I'll just provide a little bit of context about where that arises. When I spoke to a few senior researchers in Malaysia as well as Iran, about how it is that research ethics guidance is authored and is enacted, and whether or not it is informed by the Islamic tradition, many of them said, we are incredibly committed as Muslims, and we do try and embody that in our clinical practice as well as research practice as far as possible. And what I wanted to do was to dig deeper into how, what that means. And so some of them said, it happens based on the types of topics that we approve or that we consider suitable, or how it is that the research takes place. And one of the researchers said, if we were to fully enact the paradigm that predominates within the Islamic tradition, then in order for us to recruit women into a research study, a woman would have to seek the permission of her husband to leave the home. And so although I had to sort of abridge the quote that's in the book, the interview provides much more detail in his explanation of that, which is his familiarity with the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on which that is based, and he
the reported hadith. It's, as far as I mean, you point out it's not in the 6 books, and as far as I know, it's actually considered weak. But yeah.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's a weak hadith, but is one that is very well understood, very well articulated, not just within Malaysian society, but in many Muslim societies. And so he said, you will come across this when you speak to other junior researchers, other research ethics committees, and that is what I did find, that researchers said, we compromise, because we are conducting research within a global context. We don't have this requirement, but we do informally ensure that women have consulted their husbands. Sometimes we ask spouses whether they are happy for their wives to enroll into research. And although this isn't a requirement in terms of the guidelines per se, it's something that we are conscious of within the context that we reside, but also within our own understanding of the religious tradition. And so that's something that I was interested to sort of to dig deeper. And as Usaama said, I did try to find what the underlying source was, and though it wasn't in the 6th text nor in the Quran, there is commentary within the fiqh tradition. But what I was interested in was it being quoted as a tradition of the Prophet, and repeatedly so. And the articulation of it being a tradition of the Prophet carried with it a particular authority. It was something that was important for people to reinforce. It wasn't something that was expressed as being a part of the fiqh tradition. And so that was something that I was very, very interested in, that it was expressed as such, and that's how I'd analyzed it.
So, I mean, can I sort of give some thoughts on 2 possible responses to this that I would have, and you let me know if whether you think these are sensible or not. But one is to say that, okay, well, people have certain commitments that they make in good conscience. They have certain sort of ideas about what the religion should be, and I'm going to respect their autonomy to make those sorts of decisions, number one. But then the sort of the jurist in me wants to go and interrogate, what does that actually mean? And I happen to be familiar with the discussions of people like Sheikh Muhammad al-Hassan Walid, a very well-respected Mauritanian scholar who is certainly not someone who's basically trying to cave to norms that are alien to the Islamic tradition, for example. Although there's a question of, okay, well, how do you make those boundaries very clear, etc. But regardless, no one's going to question his commitment to the Sharia, in my estimation. He's one of the most learned scholars of Mauritania and probably the world. And he has pointed out that this is a statement which is found in all fiqh texts, or very widespread in fiqh texts, but it has no basis from the Prophet. And it's just something which has kind of become a norm widely accepted, but doesn't have a mustanad, so to speak. It doesn't have a leg to stand on, in a sense. And so it can't be taken as a widespread principle. Obviously, in certain contexts where there are couples and they need each other, they're always going to consult each other as to whether they will be in need of each other or whether they'll have other obligations, etc. That's how husband and wife are supposed to operate. But this kind of idea that comes from this particular, hadith, so to speak, and I put it in inverted quotes deliberately, is, it basically says, well, the husband has absolute authority on whether a woman can step out of her own house. Those sorts of ideas, I think, despite their being widespread in the fiqh tradition, do not necessarily need to, could one take on this be, okay, the person doesn't actually know their own tradition very well. They've assimilated a certain form of it that is widespread and well recognized. And so those are kind of two approaches. One is to kind of like inform them that actually, no, that's not what your tradition says. And the other is to say, well, this is something you believe in good conscience, so I'm going to let you do that, even if I disagree with you. And I wonder what you think of those two options and what is maybe more appropriate in a given context.
So it's a good question, Usaama. I mean, I would err on the side of the former rather than the latter, but I'd also want to sort of bring into this conversation something that Sheikh Akram shared with us a while ago. In terms of what happened to scholarship, in the early centuries of Islam, and when there was a sort of more of a reliance on the hadith as well as the Quran, women found themselves with a lot of freedoms and a lot of possibility in terms of having a place within social spaces. And when there was a commitment to the development of the law and the fiqh tradition, the regulatory commitment very quickly curtailed the opportunities for women, and that's an interesting sort of reflection that he has, in that history, and I wonder whether there is something there about how it is that fiqh has developed, and how there has been a reinforcing of some views and perspectives that have permeated within societies more because of, again, just the way in which women have experienced more widely, not just within Muslim contexts, an exclusion, from social spaces, political spaces, and so on. So that's something that is really, really important. But I like your the first suggestion that you make. Sadly, I think there is some truth in that second one also, which is that the level of literacy in terms of people's familiarity, their confidence, their ability to access the religious tradition is poor, is sadly poor, and I think that is reflected in some of what gets reinforced, but also their requirement for quoting something as a hadith is a crutch. It's almost, a way to reinforce their view.
Yes, I mean, although I also see sort of the desire to quote a hadith as a positive, in a sense they want to anchor their own practice in something which is going back to the Prophet. But yeah, there is a problem with the quality of the knowledge that we often receive. And I mean, perhaps this is a fixation on my part, but a lot of this to me goes back to sort of the collapse of institutions of learning under the colonial yoke, so to speak. So, that's something which is reinforcing this kind of really, it perpetuates the struggle to, re-emerge from a really abject state of ignorance in many respects. But Jazakumullah khair, this has really given me a lot of food for thought, a lot of, I hope and pray that at some point in the future I can sort of embark on this field myself to a certain extent, biomedical ethics, and reflect on some of these questions. As our conversation sort of indicated, there seems to be an urgency to some of these questions in a very practical, clinical sense as well. I did want to also add that there are some scholars who've indicated that there is this kind of transformation that takes place over time in the Islamic tradition, where the notion of women having to be more sort of secluded and sheltered becomes reinforced. So the idea of fasad al-zaman and fitna, women as fitna and things like that, become more accentuated in later centuries, apparently. I think Marion Katz and Simonetta Calderini have written in different places in their books on these sorts of topics. Amar Shasi, who's far better read than I am, a colleague of mine, will be in a better position to actually say where this is discussed at any great length. But I wanted to thank you, Mehrun, for writing this book and giving us an hour and a half of your time. And I hope that this sort of starts up a really important line of inquiry and conversation. And also, I really think people like yourselves, you're a pioneer as a woman and an alima who's writing in that crossover space. And I hope more people are inspired by yourself to embark on that sort of dual path of scholarship. And I look forward to reading your fatwas in the not too distant future as well.
Inshallah. Or we can co-author Fatawa, Usaama.
Inshallah, I'm more than happy to sort of contribute if there's anything I can contribute as well. But Jazakumullah khairan, and we can add Arzu to that as well, I suppose. So he's a mutual friend of ours from our time as undergraduates and as students of Sheikh Akram. So Jazakumullah khairan. Inshallah, I look forward to sort of reading your future work, and we will be in touch, no doubt, on sort of research issues and all sorts of other issues. But inshallah, until the next time we meet, inshallah, I'd like to thank you again, and I'd welcome everyone to sort of read Mehrun's book. I'm going to add a link to it in the description just after we end the video, inshallah.
And Usaama, just a couple of things. So firstly, Jazakallah to you. I mean, it's been such a privilege having this discussion, a lot of learning. You've given me plenty of reflection that will add to my list of things to write about and reflect on, inshallah. That's the first point. The second is, for anybody who wants to find out more, is interested in doing this type of work, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. I am always looking for more people to be joining this conversation and this space of research and practice. So please do get in touch.
Yes, and if you just Google Mehrunisha Suleman's sort of full name, you'll find her email address, online. So inshallah, you can contact her directly. And I really look forward to, you're also in a position to mentor, various scholars in various fields, given your multiple sort of qualifications. So barakallah fikum again, Mehrun. It's really been a pleasure and an honor. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.